Chapter 11. Temple Terror. David's eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness of the giant's lair, but as they did, the smell hit him like a wall of putrid stench. The smell of rotting flesh was overpowering, making it hard for him to breathe. It was a thick, cloying smell that seemed to cling to his clothes and hair. David's stomach churned as he realized that the giant had been eating something or someone. The lair was filled with bones and remains of animals, but also parts of human bones. David's heart was pounding as he realized that he had to get out of there as soon as possible before he became the giant's next meal. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he tried not to gag on the stench of death and decay. He knew that he had to focus on finding a way out and not let the smell overpower him. David's heart skipped a beat as the giant suddenly spoke to him in the local dialect. He did not understand all of the words, but he could tell that the giant's speech was surprisingly sophisticated. The giant's voice was deep and rumbling, like thunder in the distance, but it was clear that it had a certain intelligence behind it. David realized that the giant had been watching and listening to the people of the village, and had learned their language. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the giant was not just a mindless beast, but a being with its own thoughts and motivations. The giant's eyes seemed to bore into David's soul as it spoke, and David couldn't help but feel a sense of fear and awe at the same time. He knew that this was not a creature to be underestimated, and that he had to be careful if he wanted to survive this encounter. David's mind raced as he tried to process the reality of the giant in front of him. He had always thought that the stories of giants were just mythological tales, but now he was face to face with one. He wondered how it could have survived the Great Flood, and what happened after Noah left the ark. He thought about the giants in Canaan, and whether there were others that had gone elsewhere in the world. He realized that there was still so much that he did not know about the world, and that there were many mysteries yet to be uncovered. He felt a sense of fear, but also a sense of excitement at the thought of uncovering the secrets that this giant might hold. He knew that he needed to stay focused and keep his wits about him if he wanted to survive this encounter and come out of it with the knowledge he sought. If anything, it proved once again the reliability of the Bible. David couldn't help but think that the existence of this giant creature was further proof of the accuracy and reliability of the Bible. The stories of giants in the Bible were often dismissed as mere legends or myths, but now he was faced with concrete evidence that they were real. He realized that there was still much to be discovered about the world and that the Bible held many truths that were yet to be fully understood. He felt a renewed sense of conviction in his faith and knew that this experience would only strengthen his resolve to continue spreading the word of God. He felt grateful to have been given this opportunity to witness such a remarkable creature, and knew that he would always remember this encounter as a turning point in his life. David felt a chill run down his spine as the giant began to sound menacing, smacking his lips with hunger and drawing closer to him. He could feel the giant's hot breath on his face, and it smelled of rotting flesh. David could see the giant's face in the darkness, illuminated by the dim light of his torch. The giant's face was twisted in a grotesque expression of hunger, with a wide open mouth revealing sharp, yellow teeth. The skin on its face was stretched tight over its bones, giving it a gaunt and emaciated appearance. The giant's eyes were deep-set and black, with a wild and frenzied look in them. It had a long, hooked nose, and its cheeks were sunken. Its skin was a grayish-green color, and it was covered in a thick layer of matted hair. The giant's forehead was furrowed, and its eyebrows were thick and unkempt. Overall, it was a terrifying and grotesque sight that David would never forget. David reached for the can of deodorant in the outer pocket of his travel bag, his heart beating wildly with fear and adrenaline. He had a sudden idea that it might serve as a kind of mace, that it might temporarily blind the giant and give him a chance to escape. He felt a glimmer of hope as he remembered that he had not buried it deep in his bag earlier that day. He quickly sprayed the deodorant at the giant's face, hoping that it would be enough to disorient it and give him a chance to run. The giant let out a roar as the deodorant hit its eyes, and David took the opportunity to run as fast as he could. He could hear the giant thrashing and flailing behind him, but he didn't dare look back. He ran as if his life depended on it, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he had to get out of the cave and find help, and fast. David's mind was racing as he stumbled through the dark tunnel, and his only thought was to escape the giant. He had never felt so scared in his life, and he couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being followed by something much worse than a giant. He could see the first rays of sunlight streaming in. He pushed himself harder, his feet pounding against the stony ground. He burst out and into the bright light of day, gasping for air. He didn't stop to catch his breath, but kept running. He didn't know where the airport was, but he knew it had to be somewhere in this general direction. David ran through the jungle, dodging trees and leaping over streams. He could hear the sounds of the jungle around him, but he didn't pay attention to them. His only focus was on getting as far away from the temple as possible. The heat of the sun beat down on him, making him sweat, and his throat was dry and sore. But still he kept running, his legs pumping, his heart racing. After what felt like hours, David saw a break in the trees ahead and knew that he had reached the clearing. He pushed himself harder, his feet pounding against the ground. He burst out of the jungle and back into a clearing. Then he knew he had made it. He collapsed on the ground, panting and sweating, his heart pounding in his chest. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath. Then he remembered, this was the clearing they had found, which looked like something bad had happened. Now he had an idea of what that was. He chose to keep moving, although he was slower now. David trudged through the thick jungle, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the giant and the cursed treasure. The dense foliage scraped against his skin, leaving behind a trail of cuts and bruises. The heat was suffocating, making his clothes stick to his skin, and sweat poured down his face. The weight of his backpack seemed to grow heavier with each step, but he pushed on, determined to reach the airport and warn the others about the dangers lurking in the temple. As the sun set, he began building a small fire to cook his ration and keep the wild animals at bay. He couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, and kept his weapon close at hand, ready to defend himself if necessary. The night was filled with strange noises and then silence. How could David get a wink of sleep? Still. He could not shake off the feeling of being watched. The memory of the giant's face, its eyes glowing in the darkness, pressed into his mind's inner eye like a ghost. He forced himself to rest in the dark. Every hour of rest would still give him some morsel of energy on the morrow, even as his mind turned and churned. David hiked along the winding mountain road, the jungle quickly giving way to rocky terrain. The sun beat down on him mercilessly. He could feel its heat licking down his face. The road seemed to extend like infinity, the idea of reaching the airport as close as ever, like a mirage. His backpack began to increase in weight as if an unseen hand was slowly but steadily sneaking rocks into it. It felt heavy on his shoulders, and he had to take frequent breaks to catch his breath. The higher he climbed, the more breathtaking the view became, from the colors in the sea of leaves to the unusual birds dipping and gliding. He found it harder to enjoy though, while his mind stayed fixed on reaching his destination. He pushed on, determined to reach the airport and leave this place behind, once again hoping to hitchhike. He kept a steady pace, his eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of a vehicle. He had been on the road for hours and had yet to come across a single car or truck. He knew that hitchhiking was a long shot, but he couldn't help but hold out hope that someone would come along and give him a lift. As the sun began to set, David grew increasingly tired. His feet ached and his stomach grumbled with hunger. He had packed some food and water in his backpack, but it wouldn't last him too much longer. He knew that he needed to find shelter for the night. He scanned the surrounding area for a suitable spot. He didn't want to stray too far from the road in case a vehicle did come along. He soon set up his tent, started a small fire, and ate a meager dinner of dried fruit and nuts. As he lay in his tent, listening to the sounds of the mountain jackals, David couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. He was alone in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but his thoughts and the fear of what lay ahead. He closed his eyes, hoping that tomorrow would bring a change in his fortunes. The giant was covered in dirt, as if it had been living in the jungle temple passageway for a long time. Its massive fists were clenched, and it moved slowly and deliberately through the jungle, crushing everything in its path. It was heading towards the Karamunga and Jinghara tribal villages, where it knew that there were humans to be found. The giant was driven by both anger and an intense hunger for human flesh and would stop at nothing to satisfy its craving. The giant's eyes were sore and bloodshot. It stumbled onwards, squinting and rubbing at its eyes, trying to alleviate the burning sensation. What was that strange, cylindrical metal object that had been used against it? What was that fine mist that had hit its eyes? The spray was incredibly painful, and the giant could barely see through the haze of tears and pain. Its eyes were swollen and red, making it difficult for the giant to navigate through the dense jungle. Despite the pain, the giant pushed on, driven by its appetite. Animals would not do this time. After several more hours of wandering and trying to find a way to his destination, David finally caught a break. He was able to get a ride with another man who was driving a dirty brown truck. The man was different from the others he had encountered on his journey. He was very quiet and careful as he drove, but he was also very nervous on the mountain road bends. Despite this, David was grateful for the ride as it significantly reduced the time it would take for him to reach his destination. The trip that once would have taken him days was now reduced to just a few hours. David attempted to make conversation with the man driving the dirty brown truck, but it quickly became apparent that the man understood very little English. David tried to speak slowly and clearly, but the man just nodded and smiled, not seeming to understand much of what David was saying. David tried asking simple questions like, "Where are you headed?" or "How long have you been driving this truck?" But the man's answers were short and hard to understand. Despite the language barrier, David tried to keep the conversation going, but it was mostly one-sided with David doing most of the talking. The man would occasionally nod or respond with a few words, but it was clear that he was not fluent in English. David could see the man was making an effort to understand him, but it was hard for him to understand the man too. Despite the communication difficulties, David was still grateful for the ride and tried to make the best of the situation. As the sun began to set over the Karamunga village, a strange and terrifying sight appeared on the horizon. The villagers were going about their daily tasks, when suddenly, a group of warriors came running into the village, shouting and pointing towards the horizon. The villagers quickly gathered around, trying to understand what was happening. The warriors were clearly in a state of panic, and their cries of alarm soon caused an uproar in the village. The villagers looked to where the warriors were pointing and saw a massive figure approaching. It was a giant, towering over 12 feet tall, and it was headed straight towards the village. The villagers were in disbelief, as they had never seen anything like it before. The giant was a terrifying sight, with its massive size and ominous presence. The villagers could see its double-sized feet pounding the ground with each step, sending slight tremors through the earth. As the giant drew closer, the villagers could see that its skin was a dark, mottled gray, and its eyes were a deep, menacing red. It had a wide, gaping mouth with rows of jagged teeth, and its arms were thick and muscular, ending in massive hands with fingers as long as a man's arm. The warriors of the village quickly rallied, trying to defend their homes and families from the approaching giant. They grabbed their weapons, shouting war cries as they charged towards the giant. The villagers watched in horror as the warriors clashed with the giant, their weapons bouncing harmlessly off its thick skin. The giant swung its massive fists, knocking the warriors aside like rag dolls. As the battle raged on around them, John and Susan knew that they needed to find a way to stay grounded and focused. They both knew that the outcome of the battle could mean life or death for them and their comrades, and they needed to find a way to stay calm and centered in the midst of the chaos. So, they withdrew to their tents, which were located on the edge of the battlefield. Inside, they found a small space that was quiet and peaceful, away from the noise and violence of the battle. They both took a moment to catch their breath and clear their minds, before sitting down together to pray. As John and Susan were praying in their tents, John remembered a story from the Old Testament, the Battle of Jehoshaphat. In this story, Jehoshaphat and the Israelites were surrounded by enemies, and they were outnumbered and outmatched. But Jehoshaphat knew that their only hope was to put their trust in God and to praise Him, so he led the Israelites in singing praises to God. And as they sang, God fought for them and they were able to defeat their enemies. John knew that this story was a powerful reminder of the power of praising God and putting their trust in Him. He suggested to Susan that they both go out and sing praises to God, letting Him fight for them in the battle. Susan agreed, and they both stepped out of their tents and walked towards the front line of the battle. As they walked, they began to sing hymns of praise, their voices rising above the din of the battle. Their singing was a powerful reminder that God was with them, and that they were not alone. They sang with all their hearts, putting their trust in God and asking for His protection and guidance. Their comrades on the battlefield, who were fighting and struggling, could hear their singing and it gave them hope and courage. They felt a sense of unity and connection with John and Susan, and they knew that they were all fighting together, with God on their side. As they sang, the tide of the battle was about to turn. The villagers could see that the giant was headed straight for the center of the village, where their homes and families were. They knew that they had to do something to stop it, but they didn't know what. They could see their friends and loved ones in danger, and they knew that they had to act fast. In that moment of crisis, an unlikely hero emerged. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, stepped forward, his face determined. He had a small bow and arrow and he pulled it back, aiming at the giant. The villagers held their breath as the boy released 2 arrows, watching as they flew through the air and with amazing precision struck the giant in its red sore eyes. The giant let out a deafening roar as it stumbled and fell, its body crashing to the ground with a thunderous boom. The villagers were in shock, but they were also overjoyed. They knew that the young boy had saved their village and they quickly ran to him, lifting him up and carrying him on their shoulders, hailing him as a hero. After that night, the village and the neighboring villages, they spoke of the giant's attack and the bravery of the young boy, and it was passed on from generation to generation. His name would be remembered and honored for centuries to come, and the village of Karamunga was forever changed by that fateful encounter with the giant. John and Susan knew that it was not just them and their comrades who had won the battle, but it was God who fought and won the battle. The parents of the boy later admitted their son had never had great aim prior. They knew that they had to give all the glory to God, and they praised Him for His power and His love. From that day on, they knew that no matter what challenges they faced, they could always put their trust in God and He would fight for them. They sang even louder, praising God for His power and His love.